Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to discussing remote physical evaluations. And we have our two panelists here. So we'll just give everyone another couple of minutes to sign in. This is our first panelist, Dr. Ottenheimer. Okay, let me now move to read the bios of our panelists. We have Dr. Ranit Mishori, who is a professor of family medicine at the Georgetown University School of Medicine and director of the department's global health initiatives. Her career includes academia, scholarship, clinical care, mentorship, and leadership roles in public health, global health, medical education, care of underserved populations, and human rights. Dr. Mishori has been at the forefront of international and national discussions on the health consequences of forced migration and associated human rights issues. She graduated from the Georgetown University Providence Hospital Family Medicine Residency and received her medical degree from Georgetown University School of Medicine, as well as a master's in international public health, the disease control and prevention track from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Deborah Ottenheimer is the director of the Women's Holistic Health Initiative at Harlem United and is an active member of Physicians for Human Rights, as well as serving as faculty at the Human Rights Program at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, the Weill Cornell Clinic for Human Rights, and the CUNY School of Medicine Human Rights Collaborative, aiding survivors of gender-based violence, including female genital mutilation and cutting, domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking in their applications for asylum. She has published and lectured extensively on human rights violations against women with a focus on female genital mutilation and cutting. She has also worked in Haiti, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. She received her medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, where she was awarded the Paul Stoley Award in Clinical Epidemiology. Dr. Ottenheimer completed her residency at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital in Manhattan. So with that, you now have a background on our two panelists, and we're so glad that you've joined us today for an hour-long webinar on best practices in conducting remote physical evaluations. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And if you don't mind uploading, we're going to upload our slides. And of course, at the end, we will give you access to all the information in today's webinar. But I am, that's wonderful. So let's start with the first slide. So by now, we've all had a couple of weeks of, for those of you who are practicing in the ambulatory setting, I am guessing that most of you, if not all of you, have had an opportunity to do some form of e-visits, virtual visits, or video visits. So we're going to touch upon some of these same skills, but in the context of asylum today. We're going to talk a little bit about technical platforms, about setting up the visit, about how to communicate with your client and with the attorney, history-taking, physical examination, where we'll touch on confidentiality and security of doing something like that through remote platforms, and even talk about translators, medical students, and some regulatory issues, though neither of us is a regulatory expert. So that's something that it may depend on the state where you are. So Catherine, can you go to the next one? So in general, remote evaluations, as you know, in the past have not been recommended for asylum evaluations because of some thinking that it might impact the judges or the legal proceedings negatively, and they've been conducted only when there were no other options. There's really only one study that looked at telephonic psych evaluations, comparing 10 remote evaluations to 20 in person. And really what they found was that the efficacy was pretty much similar in terms of obtaining the history of torture, obtaining their psychiatric history, and diagnosing mental health conditions. And there was no difference in the ability to accurately diagnose whether you had remote or in-person evaluation, because it relied on the same clinical skills that all of you have by now. Of course, in terms of telehealth in general, not related to asylum, there's a lot of evidence that telehealth has no inferiority to in-person visits for many conditions and in many settings and context. Next slide. So one of the questions that we get most commonly is, what can I use? What platforms can I use? I think many of us who are affiliated with health institutions or academic institutions have access to at least one of the more commercially available or large platform organizations like Zoom, WebEx, or BlueJeans. So if you have access, you can use it. I think some of them also have an option for a free option, but one thing to beware is if you do Zoom as a free option, I think it cuts you off after an hour, and as we know, 1 hour may not be enough. I've done remote evaluations and remote visits through WhatsApp and FaceTime. So that is also an option. You can use your phone, you can use a tablet, you can use your laptop, whatever works best in your setting and in terms of the equipment that you have. I know some people who did Google Hangouts video evaluations, but the bottom line is use what you know, use what you have access to, but definitely don't use anything that's public facing like Facebook Live or TikTok, unless you want to dance while you're doing the evaluation, or any other public-facing applications. Next slide. I think what the bottom line, and we're going to circulate one at the very end or after we're done with this webinar, is to create some sort of a checklist for yourself, but also for the attorney, and talk about what you need to set up, and we'll review that in a second, what needs to happen in terms of the materials, the setting, what may be useful to have on hand. It is critically important to have a conversation with the attorney prior to the visit to talk about what their priorities are, how to prepare the client, and what the logistics are. And as with, you may have encountered already with our recent e-visits, you need to be flexible. Technology does crash on you when you least expect it, and things happen. Next one. It's critically important to talk to the attorney about what the most important aspects of the case is, because you will have to be flexible. The technology may not work as planned. So you want to establish that the critical parts of the physical are done first. It may not be a situation when usually we talk about doing head to toe. This may not be a situation where you do a head to toe physical examination, but Dr. Ottenheimer is going to talk about that a little bit more. We need to plan ahead of time with the client and with the attorney what happens if there are technical glitches. And we need to be aware of what is the most important thing to gather in case a technical glitch happens and after an hour you get cut off. So you want to at least make sure you have what's needed for the time until you create another opportunity to have a remote evaluation. Next one. It is important for you as a clinician to have a well-lit room and focus the camera on your face throughout the encounter. You want to create a situation where everybody feels comfortable, where there's eye contact as much as possible with your client. I think it doesn't need to be said, but dress professionally. Don't wear your sweatpants or your exercise clothes, or at least, whatever happens from the waist down is up to you, but waist up, make sure you look professional. If you're using your phone, consider using a tripod. You don't want the phone to kind of slid down and ruin the moment for you. And also want to ask the client to sit in a well-lit area and ask them to use a mobile device. And we'll talk about how that fits in with your physical examination in a little bit. Next one. It is critically important to find a place that is private, where you can be sitting for 2 to 3 hours, just like any other asylum evaluation, where you're not going to be disrupted by your dog or your children who are at the moment, I'm sure most of them are at home, any sounds from the outside, but you also want to make sure, as we said before, that it's a place that looks welcoming, that's well lit, so you don't, some people may have certain images of dark enclosed spaces that may re-traumatize them, so it needs to be open, it needs to be sunny, it needs to have some sort of a positive background, so it doesn't feel like a cell, or doesn't feel like a prison cell, or some sort of a confined place. Of course, you want to work with the attorney and the client before the scheduled evaluation to make sure that the client, him or herself, also have a private space where they can sit for 2 to 3 hours without interruptions, because they'll be obviously recounting very traumatic experiences. So you want to minimize interruptions as much as possible. Next one. Dr. Ottenheimer will speak a little bit more about how to do a physical evaluation and evaluate scarring or other skin signs. But ideally, you would want to ask the client to have a flashlight on hand, to have a ruler or a coin, so it can be used later on for evaluation of skin changes. Next one. I can't stress this enough, but you want to make sure that the computer or your device is fully charged and plugged in. Just the other day, we had a situation with a regular e-visit where suddenly the battery ran out, and it was not obviously conducive to having a good report with the patient or with the client. Make sure the client's device is also fully charged, that there's internet or Wi-Fi access where you are, but also where the client is. And it would be ideal to have a strong enough Wi-Fi signal that you can maintain a video as well as audio. So that may require some planning ahead of time. And then, of course, before you start the visit, make sure the webcam and audio are working. So it's always good to do a little trial with a family member or a friend to make sure that your angle is right, the lighting is good, there's no weird stuff behind you to interrupt the client's attention from you and from the history that you're going to be obtaining. Next one. So I think we all know by now that Zoom is HIPAA compliant, but at this point, it's also important to remember that no virtual platform is 100% secure. And of course, with Zoom, the Zoom bombing news has been a little bit concerning for all of us, although the company has made sure to report that they've made some fixes. If you're using Zoom, make sure to use Zoom with a password, so only you and the client, or is needed, translator can go in. So check the security features of Zoom and WebEx and any of the other kind of large commercial platforms. But nothing is 100% secure, so this needs to come up as part of the informed consent discussion with the client ahead of time. Obviously, you're going to make any effort to make sure that this what you're doing is fully private and confidential and secure, but you can't guarantee it. So the clients need to be aware that there is an option for something to go wrong. It is critically important to not tape the encounter. And please continue, please take notes as you conduct the evaluation. How you do that is up to you. Sometimes you can take notes if you're using a computer as you're watching the client recount their story. Sometimes you can take notes on the side, and then it's up to you. But you will have to also explain to the client what you're doing if you're going to take notes and look to the side and kind of break the eye contact with them. Of course, with consent, you can, when you do it and where and how you do it is up to you. You can do it just as you begin the evaluation. You can take verbal consent. You can try an online signature if you have the ability to do that, or you can do that through email or with the attorney. Taking oral consent on the phone ahead of time. It's up to you. There's no best way, but consent needs to be, there are a lot of issues that relate to doing remote evaluations that need to be discussed as part of your routine consent process. Next. Communication is obviously critically important. It's much harder to build rapport when you're not in the same room with the patient, when they can't see your general body language. I don't know about you, I'm a toucher and a hugger, and so it's hard to not do that when you're on a remote platform, but you want to try to replicate the feeling of an in-person interaction. So the camera should focus on your face. Try to set it up so it's at the same height as your face, as your eyes. Look at the camera, don't look at the screen. So try to make sure that you can even put a little sticker where the camera is to remind yourself to look at the camera, and then set up the camera to be at eye level and have a lot of light around you, so it's not sort of a dark and foreboding environment that the client has to see. Next one. Very, very important to talk about what to expect in terms of technical glitches. So, if something happens, you want to prepare the client if it happens in the middle of them recounting something from their torture experience. What should they expect? I will call you right back, or stay online, or you need to log off if something happens, and then we can reconnect. And of course, describe the setting to say, for example, I'm sitting in a private room, I'm sitting in my study. There may be interruptions. You may hear the dog bark. You may hear something on the street. But doing all of that to minimize distractions and startle responses, because of course this is what you're going to be hearing and what you're going to be asking are all narratives that may make the client have to reveal some very sensitive stuff. I mean, we're not doing a routine asylum evaluation. I think you all understand that. So interruptions can be very, very distracting to people. So just kind of set up the expectations and the eventuality that something might happen and how you're going to be addressing it. Next. We've already talked about making eye contact. Turn off your email, turn off Twitter, turn off your instant messaging so they don't kind of show up on the screen and distract you. If you have your phone near you, make sure it's turned off, again, so that you don't get text from your children. When is dinner ready? And, where is my mask? So all of that needs to be turned off. It's, I have to say it because it happens, and it's not, this is always the last thing that we forget to do. Facial expressions, body language, there's not much that they can see, but for whatever they can see, try to make it as welcoming and appropriate to the circumstances, to the story and the narrative that the client is expressing or as what they're telling you at the moment. It's okay to laugh, it's okay to make light of certain things, but obviously when you're taking is a part of the history taking, that is inappropriate, but you can always make light of the situation and the awkwardness of the remote setup. Tell the client you'll be taking notes, and if you need to turn around and write something so that they know why you're turning your gaze away from the camera. Can go to the next one. I'm going to turn this over to Deborah to continue, and we'll have more information later.
Great. So yeah, I think that the transition to telehealth for all of us is probably incredibly helpful for this process. Essentially for the history taking, it's it's going to be similar to what you usually do. Again, allowing for the glitches, the interruptions. I always begin my my evaluations by explaining each step of the process. Some are different than others, and I think in this case it's even more important because you're remote from the patient or remote from the client, and so that it's a way to let them know what to expect. And you need to also remember to tell them that they can take bathroom breaks. If you need a bathroom break, you could take a bathroom break, get a glass of water, get some tissues, all those things that you would normally do in your office or in your clinic where you're usually doing evaluations still hold, but it might feel more awkward because it's on TV. Usual consent process. I actually like doing a teach back consent because so many of the clients have limited literacy, maybe no literacy at all in English. And with video, I find that the teach back process works pretty nicely. Of course, a trauma-informed approach is important, and Ranit spoke about your surroundings and how to approach that. Again, looking at the camera, it is really distracting. I realized I did not turn off my watch, so it keeps buzzing, so be careful about that too. Even more than usual, you need to be super prepared. I am not at all used to video and telehealth. I find it incredibly distracting, and I need to be extra prepared, I think, for these encounters. Very important to acknowledge the awkwardness, as Ranit said. It is awkward. It's awkward to tell your deepest, darkest secrets to someone that you've never met on a video camera. And it's important to acknowledge how difficult it is to share those personal and painful events, even in person, even more so with a video. Next slide. Something I'm finding with telehealth, which I'm also finding with my asylum evaluations, is the quality of the camera is very variable for folks. So clients may have a mobile device, but you do need to be ready for the fact that the camera on the mobile device might be terrible. It's also interesting to find that what I think is an obvious instruction is not always that obvious to the client. They usually have a particular scar or something that they want to show you, and they bring the camera in super close, or it's too far. It takes a lot of flexibility and back and forth to get an image that you can actually interpret, especially if the lighting is bad, especially if the skin tone of your client and the skin tone of their surroundings are too similar. The other thing that's difficult is a lot of the lights on our cell phones are really bright. They're LED lights, and they're actually not that great for taking photographs of what may be perhaps subtle scars on difficult to visualize areas of the body. So that may also be difficult. I would consider asking them to use a flashlight instead, hopefully one that has maybe variable settings, even if you need a dimmer light. The ruler or the coin are super helpful for describing the size of the lesion, and we all do that as part of our routine, but this is especially important. And if your client is worried that they don't have a ruler, a coin, or really any other common object that you would find in the home that will help you see the size and scale of the lesion is sufficient. Next slide, please. I think we beat the trauma-informed approach to death, but remember that sensitive parts of the body, genitalia, male and female breasts or the buttocks, are off limits in terms of visualization on video or taking photographs. You could ask the client to take a photograph, not of their genitalia, but perhaps of a particular scar that you were not able to visualize properly or that you want to include in your affidavit. But remember that the picture may be of poor quality and the sending of the picture is not necessarily secure in the same way that the video platforms may not be secure. One possible approach would be to have the attorney open a secure box, like box or Dropbox, in which to place photo files and even your affidavit drafts. But that also may or may not be available to them. Next slide. So one very near and dear to my heart is gender-based and domestic violence evaluation. Something that's very important to remember is verify that the client is not living with the perpetrator or their allies, which would not be unusual. Actually, in this time of shutdown, I live in New York City. The news is full of the fact that there's less street crime, but no one's talking about the fact that there is a massive increase in domestic violence and intimate partner violence and child abuse because everyone's home and not able to escape their abusers. So in advance of your evaluation, it's very important to be sure that the client doesn't live with the perpetrator or with someone who knows the perpetrator or may be allied with the perpetrator. Again, video and photographic exam of the genitals is not appropriate. However, you can ask very specific questions. For example, if someone was raped repeatedly anally, they may have fecal incontinence, which you would ordinarily ask about, but because we won't have pictures and you won't have the exam of that area, the description in the affidavit becomes even more significant than it might have been if you had the support of a visual evaluation. Same thing with female genital cutting. We would always be asking about sexual function, birth complications, urinary symptoms, but even more detail and even more description is going to lend credence in the absence of a visual inspection. Next slide, please. So working with students and translators is both wonderful and difficult, even in the best of circumstances. One thing that's very important in terms of translators and the platform that you're using is, can you turn them on, turn their video on and off? Because it may not be appropriate for the translator to see the physical exam. I know in real life exams, often I have the translator step out or stand on the other side of the door. In this case, we need to have them turn off their video, and hopefully you'll have a platform that allows for that. The other thing that you have to remember is back to the communication issue, you want to look at the client, even though it may be the translator who's talking, and that may be even more difficult with the video. I find the different screens on video very distracting. And that's the idea of the sticker on the camera that Ranit mentioned, I find actually very helpful. Just a regular Post-it note works. Medical students can listen. They usually should be unobtrusive, and in this case, they really need to be silent, but I would encourage you to meet with them beforehand, as hopefully you usually do. Get them to read and prepare questions. And if the platform that you're using is amenable, they could even send you a chat message if they feel that you missed something or you forgot to mention something that you had spoken about before. But nonetheless, they need to stay to the background, taking notes. One other thing I did forget to mention back with physical exam, if you don't use a body diagram, this might be the time to start using it, because You're not going to be doing your usual organized top to bottom, left to right exam. So it will help you remember what you've seen and where you've seen it. And if you have any artistic abilities, this is your time to shine. If you can sketch the contours or the specifics of a scar in such a way that it's informative, and substitute that for a blurry picture that you may or may not get, so much the better. Otherwise, you need to be very, you need to really use your language to describe fully, since you won't have the photographs as additional information. Next slide. So I think we spoke about this at the beginning. The attorney has a lot of responsibilities, and I do like to make them a checklist. Many of them are a little distracted and baffled by this new technology space for evaluations as well. They really, really have to do the due diligence at the beginning, to do a tech dry run with the client, to be aware of the technology available to the client, to really explain to the client exactly what will be taking place and why. It's not always the case that clients understand what's going to happen in an evaluation. There are legal issues that may arise from the use of remote physical evaluation that need to be discussed on a case-by-case and state-by-state basis, of course. And it is incumbent on the attorney and, of course, the medical provider to discuss the case in advance, since the physical exam is going to be limited. We need to know even more clearly than usual where to place the emphasis, so that if we have a technology outage or some other glitch that happens, we at least have been able to gather the most important information. Next slide. And I'm going to hand this back to Dr. Mishori to talk about regulatory issues.
Thank you so much. So again, as I mentioned before, we're not regulatory experts, and there are two issues. One is, as you know, an asylum evaluation is not really medical care. So, but I know that many health systems and hospitals interpret it as if it were medical care in terms of their risk management and the need for consent, and even where you put the information in, whether it's part of a chart or not. And that varies location to location, setting to setting. But since the reason we are switching now to remote visits is because of the COVID-19 crisis. And even though this is what we're talking about is not really about e-health and telehealth in the classic definition, the federal government has made some changes and loosened a lot of the restrictions for telehealth. So it can also apply to asylum evaluations, even though, you know, classically this is not a medical visit. So we just wanted to bring this to your attention in case you don't know it. You are now allowed to practice across state line. So even though PHR does not generally recommend that you, or does not even place cases across state line, but it is possible right now, and it may be, you know, it may be applicable to doing evaluations in detention centers that are more remote, but that needs to be discussed ahead of time with your attorney, so you don't just waste time and resources and or the client's time and not be able to present it as a legally binding affidavit. So the barriers to practicing across state line have been removed. Again, that's true of e-visits and not necessarily applicable to asylum evaluations, because those are not technically speaking, regular medical visits. I'm gonna read a couple of questions, and we are welcoming more questions from you, both of us. But one question is related to doing something remote, and it's, I think it's from Kim Griswold. Hey, Kim, how are you? I'm sorry I can't see you, but I hope you're well. Do you think it might be possible to do a remote exam with a detainee in a local detention center? So as you know, detention centers have been trying to adjust to some of the issues related to the coronavirus outbreaks, and with the severe limitations to who can visit these days, possibly in most places there are no visitations whatsoever, including in some cases from their attorneys or any representatives. Ideally, you could do that, but that requires some sort of a remote internet infrastructure in some of these centers, which are not always available, especially in detention centers that are in remote areas. I don't know if Catherine wants to also talk about that, but that again is something that would be good to talk to the attorney, because some attorneys have had the option of conducting remote meetings with their clients. Catherine, anything that you want to add about our experience with that so far?
Yes, absolutely. We have, so as Dr. Mishori mentioned, PHR doesn't place interstate cases, although it's really great news that the government is relaxing these strict licensing requirements. So I think that's, you know, something that people in different settings might want to explore. But within states, we have certainly placed evaluations, I think primarily psych evaluations. So as we mentioned at the very beginning, the research around the physical evaluations is more limited. So we would really welcome, you know, clinicians to share their experiences, and that's something we really want to develop, that understanding around remote evaluations generally, but we have done some.
Ideally, if you do that in a detention center, you need to be even super extra careful about the physical aspect, because you don't know who else is in the room, and you may not have 2 to 3 hours, you may only have a half an hour. So that requires a lot of coordination with the attorney representing the client, and the attorney can serve as a go-between to see if they can be if this could be set up with the detention center authorities. So it's going to be more complicated than doing something where the asylum seeker is in the community, but it's doable. And if you're doing them, again, as Catherine was saying, we would love to hear about your experience, so we can teach others. Deborah, do you have any?
No, it's hard to even get a phone into a detention center when you're there in person. It would be, I think, challenging, but maybe it will change.
Yeah, and I think the rural nature of many detention centers, you know, is even more complication, much more of a complicating factor, because the bandwidth in general in rural areas in the U.S. is not good. Another question is it ever possible for the attorney to obtain any medical records of the client that might be shared with us? Sure. I think that's, Deborah, do you want to take
that? Happens all the time anyway, so it shouldn't be an issue. Even from prisons, I've had, for incarcerated detainees, I've had people send me, sorry, I gotta take this out of my ear. I've had people send me medical records, extensive medical records.
Right.
It don't always answer the questions that you want answered, but they are there, and sometimes you can get them from abroad as well.
Right. In many cases, they don't have them. They didn't bring anything, but if they exist, if the people are in detention, you may be able to have access to them. And the question about how to transmit them so they're a little bit more secure is a question you need to ask yourself and ask the client. There are certain email or file sharing programs that are more secure I think, in medical institutions, for example, at my university, we have something called Box, and Box is HIPAA compliant. Right. So again, that's something that will need to be negotiated with the attorney and representing the client. Another question from Jordan Greenbaum. Hi, Jordan. Jordan is a god in the world of human trafficking. Is it appropriate to ask the client to have a trusted person help with the physical examination, hold the phone, take the pictures? Otherwise, photographing the posterior aspect of the body is tough.
It's really hard. I think it depends. I would also talk to the attorney, because that might be problematic in terms of the affidavit itself and who is present and who is not present, and is that person really trusted? Again, I'm talking from the perspective of gender-based violence in particular. I think it depends. This is one of those spaces where you have to be flexible, but agreed. I've been trying to imagine how to get someone to take a picture of the middle of their back, and I don't see how you can without someone helping you, or them propping up the phone somehow and then you directing them. I think it's a case by case.
Yeah, and depending on who, if there's a trusted person at home, then there may be a situation you may just want to have them come in just to take the picture, as opposed to listening in on the evaluation.
I would say be very careful that trusted person is not a child.
Right. Just like with
translators, just like with clinical care, but it might be tempting.
We have another question from Colleen Killahan. Hi, Colleen.
Hi, Colleen.
Very big mentor to both of us. Is anyone doing photos via Zoom versus having a client send you photos? So the question to me is, do you take a picture of, so it's hard to take a picture on the computer through Zoom. The idea is not to record the whole session. The question is, do you want to bring your own camera and take a picture of the screen? Personally, I think the quality is not as good as if you're asking the client to take a picture with their own phone and then send it, again, ideally through something that is a little bit more secure. But Deborah, if you have a different idea.
I mean, I've done both. I've done a screenshot of the Zoom and had someone send me the picture. And, if the picture doesn't make it, at least it might be a reminder to you, but I'm not sure it's going to be ever good quality for you to include in an affidavit.
The other thing that I wanted to say is that, there sometimes, depending on the deadline of when the affidavits are due, you can do whatever you can right now. And if restrictions on in-person visits are lifted in the next 4, 5, 6 weeks, it's possible to do part of the evaluation now, and then you're just scheduling them to come in and you do the physical examination and take the pictures as necessary. But again, because there's no predicting on when some of these restrictions are going to be lifted, you may, and the affidavit is due sooner, you may want to do everything in one sitting. Also, reminder that some of the immigration proceedings have been postponed, and because everybody's on lockdown. So again, that may make the deadlines also moot. So you may want to think about just doing all of it or some of it at a later date, but that needs to be coordinated with the attorney, of course.
I've also had one instance, which was an FGC case. So obviously the physical exam is super important. And what we did was we did the eval remotely, and then we agreed that we would add an addendum when it was possible to come back and bring that patient in person. We would add an addendum to the affidavit.
Colleen is asking another question. Any problem with evidence collection with patients taking their own photos? So, I mean, obviously the admissibility of such pictures in court, depending on who the judge is, can be an issue in some cases. You want to be certain that the judge is aware that the client took pictures, and you can certify that that's the picture of the client and not some other random photo. So I think there are two ways of addressing it. One is, first of all, checking with the attorney whether that would be admissible and whether you should do it. And this may be a situation where you don't rely on a photo and you just use the pictogram. And the second one is you can put as part of your affidavit a statement saying, I observed the client take a picture during our remote evaluation. And the reason we did the remote evaluation is because of the COVID crisis. So, you know, the whole world knows that that's where healthcare is going right now. So again, check with the attorney, but it is my understanding that if you have a statement that is part of your signed affidavit saying I observed, and this is as far to the best of my ability to ascertain that the client took a picture while I was interviewing them, and this indeed is representative of what I observed through a remote evaluation, that may suffice when you talk about the admissibility of that picture in the court proceedings. Another question from Gordon Magonet or Majonet, depending on, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. I'm unsure if this is practical, but there is on the iPhone the option to have a delay before the shutter fires. The client would need to set the timer, let's say for 10 seconds, and then turn his or her back towards the camera. Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a good idea, and you can do that. It may affect the quality, and it may be difficult because you're looking at very specific contours of the body, and the lighting is important so that you can see it, especially on skins that are darker, but it would
work for something big, like a big stripe from a whipping or something like that. But for small things, I think that would be hard.
Any other questions? I think we are okay. All right, there's a question that we're not gonna answer, but we will get in touch with you privately to talk about that, and you can get in touch with us after the presentation. I think, Catherine, I don't know if you wanna summarize or give us some updates on what we're gonna do with this content and with a similar discussion that you've all had on psych evaluations.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mishori and Dr. Ottenheimer. That was a wonderful presentation. We will send out an email next week. PHR, the office is actually closed on Monday, so give us until, you know, mid-late next week, but we'll certainly upload the recording and send you guys all a follow-up email with the materials mentioned in the webinar. Right now on the PHR website, you can see there are links to recordings also of the remote psychological evaluation webinar and a webinar on writing expert declarations. Those are both available on the website. So rest assured, you will certainly receive a recording and follow-up email from us. And as well, you know, you can reach out to the asylum program if you have additional questions. And, you know, if we see that we're receiving the same question, we can create, you know, a Q&A depending on the kind of response that we get. But I think this presentation really covered the crucial issues that you need to move forward in conducting remote physical evaluations. So thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you for doing this work.
Yes.